Welcome back. I'm David Dibosa, for those of you who weren't here this morning, and I'm Director of Research and Interpretation here at Tate. It stands to me to present this afternoon session, Revoicing Resoundings, or Resoundings, around collections. And I do so due to the fact that, as advertised, Anne Barlow, our Director of Tate St Ives, unfortunately cannot be with us due to health reasons for this afternoon. So I'm sure you join me in wishing her well. This afternoon's discussions will focus around questions around collections, and I think will segue neatly with a series of concerns which were raised in the earlier discussions. We're going to be asking questions about the ways in which collections are constituted and entangled in a suite of questions around national and international histories. What are those narratives? I think we were directed through Andrew's poignant conversation around the question of gaps and elisions, and I think both Alice and Anjali pointed towards the ways in which our research into collections open up those spaces of inquiry. This afternoon's questions take that as a point of departure, and we begin to ask the questions about how we might attend to the unheard voices, both inside and outside of museums. We look at how artists and objects speak out and speak back, sound off and sound out in relation to the work that they do. So I feel that this afternoon there is a provocation for us around the question of how we attend to the presence of the artwork and the potential of art to speak in both serious and playful registers. The emphasis will be around questions of interruption, around questions of disruption, resistance, around intervention and indeed invention. What I feel we're underlining in this is the question of the work of art beyond its objecthood. We have been addressing, for very good reasons, as we've lined out over the past few days, the question about the object in respect of its datification. How does meaning somehow come unpeeled from the art object? And what happens to that meaning once it enters the spaces of data, information, and data technology? For this afternoon, what we want to turn our attention to is the question of what remains, how the artwork exceeds, goes beyond, escapes, as it always does, as we know, the spaces of mediation which are provided through our symbolic systems and our symbolic orders. To join me in that, and I believe return us to some of those points around the liberatory promise of this conference and the conversations that are unfolding, are two distinguished colleagues and, I dare say, friends. First of all, the wonderful Dr. Charl Landvreugd, whose name also has a name closer to my own people's, Imolu Ile Idun, who we know for many years, Charl. We've been delighted in conversations that we've had with you and a whole suite of issues and conversations. And currently, those have come to fruition in your role now as head of research and curatorial practice at the wonderful Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. We know that from the history, and I'm sure you've looked, everyone, you've been looking through the outline, but I'm going to take delight in your history, Charl, as a Fulbright scholar, as an alumnus of Columbia University, and also the detail of your PhD, which I know we spoke about over time at the RCA, titled Imagining, Tracing, Experiencing, Inhabiting, Projecting, Locating Afro Artists as Culturally Native to the Dutch Art World. You've been developing for many years this critique of the question of blackness in relation to the European context, and specifically in relation to the context of the Dutch art production. I very much look forward to hearing what you have to say today. And following your talk, I'll be able to welcome everyone, Professor Susan Puisan-Locke, to the lectern. But for now, join me in welcoming Dr. Charl Landvreugd.
Oh, hello. Hello. I thought Susan was first, so I was still pondering my thoughts. You know, the problem with having many conversations with these great people is that when you then have to finally do your talk, you kind of don't know what to talk about anymore. And this harks into what the colleague in the last panel, the last one person, sorry I don't know your name, with the great long hair, said about kind of a prehistory of archives. I would like to say that I can only speak of the context of the Netherlands, where I practice as an artist, a curator and researcher in an institution, in a role of institutional leadership. The Netherlands is quite different from the UK. We have our own set of issues, we have our own history, and within trying to convey or trying to think of a sense of Afro-Europeanness, I always look at Black British theory as a generous aunt or uncle who has helped us think through the issues that we are dealing with. The issues that we are dealing with, one of them I think that might be of great interest to you is that there is such a thing as Black British or Caribbean British. There's actually a box you can tick when you sign up for anything. In the continent of Europe or in the Netherlands, we don't have that. We don't have Black Dutch or Caribbean Dutch. So we are there physically. We exist in, how do I say it, policies, but we have no name yet. And as Professor Simon O'Sullivan declared, the people who are yet to come but are already there, right? Which is like a whole different situation than the British one. So revoicing, resounding collections, for me works for me by bringing action research to curatorial practice. What does that mean is that the action research, I'll just reiterate it, action research, kind of research you do where not only the subject changes, but you as a person also changes. This is very important within the context of the Netherlands, and that's why I read it as museum machine and me, rather than museum machine me. It's the museum machine and me. Because once the body enters the museum machine, something happens to it. Specifically, when it is a Black body in a executive or leadership role entering the museum machine, something happens. Things happen that could not happen had that body not been there. And it is specifically those things that happen when the body is not there, and that what it does to the actual practitioner would then be what I call then the action research in a curatorial, as curatorial practice. I've also been pondering, because I've been working in quite a lot of boards and trustees functions, whether the thing I'm talking about might not be called governance as an artistic practice. Is that actually possible? I'm just laying it out here. So it is specifically in rethinking and reimagining this entanglement that the body of the artist researcher has in a position of curatorial practice, where I think that that whole presence can become an artistic act. I hope I'm being clear with the examples that I mentioned before. Or at least so I imagined. So what are we dealing with? We are talking about several things here. We talked about, you used a very beautiful word, not racialized, but minoritized people. Yeah? This is a new word to me, so thank you for that. Racialized language, concepts that one has to deal with. I don't want to take much of your time, but I think it would be most useful today if I gave you some practical examples of how we dealt with it. One of the main issues when we talk about interpretation, when we talk about language, is that, for instance, male artists, white male artists, seem to have learned everything they know by themselves. Women artists were always apprenticed somewhere or learned their skill by, or were somewhere, they were always involved with something that gave them the skills to actually be able to do it. So, when we start talking about interpretation, because as head of research, I'm also responsible for all the text, I was like, what are we going to do about that? So we either talk about all the men and where they learned their skills, or we take it out completely. So now in all the texts in the museum, women didn't learn their skill anywhere. They just do, as the men do. This was not a decision I made. This is a decision that was put forward to the curatorial team. What are we going to do with it? It's just like the decision, white male artist is just white male artist. So let's say Willem de Koning is amazing, he's from this year. Willem de Koning, year. And then we have Ella Natsui, Ghana, and year. Again, a question put forward to the curatorial team. We either say Willem de Koning, Rotterdam, 1937, you know, Ella Natsui, Kumasi, date, or we don't do it at all. I don't want to say it's the composition of the curatorial team, because we have a great team. But the decision was made to then not name it at all. And in my head, what does this do then to the artist researcher working in this space? Thinking through, let's say, a racialized lens in a predominantly, well, let's say a 99.99% white environment. Apparently then, it is too tough to start turning all the great artists into subjects of racialized subjects, so to speak. It's tougher to do that than to, let's say, de-racialize the racialized subjects. This is the conclusion I drew from that. Okay. So these are two very, let's say, direct examples of what then going into the space as an artist, as a researcher, thinking about these topics, what you can bring to it. The next topic I would then like to bring to the fore also goes into what the colleague with the great long hair was talking about. Andrew, thank you. Andrew, in the past 4 years, we had, of course, the big moment where everything was being questioned. And we were being asked, how many women are in your collection? How many non-binary people are in your collection? How many black people are in your collection? How many Southeast Asian people are in your collection, etc., etc. Now here comes the problem. And this is the problem, a problem that I think is solved through, let's say, artistic thinking, but also is solved through the presence of a black body in a space when thinking these things through. Because how many women is quite it's not that easy, but it's a relatively easy task to fulfill. How many non-binary people becomes a problem. How many black people also becomes a problem. And why does it become a problem, how many black people? Because you don't know who's black. You don't know who identifies as black. You don't know who wanted to be identified as black. So what we decided is to just give you the data. We just give you the data. And where we tell you where someone was born, and where someone was born doesn't say anything about who this person is, right? Where someone lived and where someone worked. Because look at me, it would be fairly easy to say he's a Surinamese artist, but I don't identify as a Surinamese artist. I identify as a Dutch artist. right? And if you look at my name, Charl Landvreugd, well, you couldn't possibly, if you're Dutch, think that I'm not Dutch, because the name is as Dutch as it comes, right? So for us to go back into the archive and try and find out from all these artists what or how they possibly identified and what and how we should then redo them in the ATLIP, what's it called, the archiving system, that's quite a task. It's a very, very big task. So what we did, basically, when people ask a question like this, we just give them the data. Because what you consider black is not what I consider black. What you consider Dutch is not what I consider Dutch. So the question is always in a subjective, I know what I'm trying to say, in a subjective way charged, depending on, is it an activist asking the question out of a certain ideology, you know? Is it a researcher asking this question? And it's always charged. So we cannot answer this question. And therefore also we could come back to what do we put on next to the names of the artist. So now there is talk because people are complaining, yeah, we don't know where these people are from. We all know, if you look at the name of the artist, you look at where they are born, immediately the work is charged with a lot of thinking, right? So while I was doing my PhD, I was thinking about how can one create a normal space, a kind of normal space where everything is and everybody is treated equally. So with that, as an artist within the museum, I created a space on the name tags, basically, where everybody is treated equally in exactly the same way, and it would only be by your knowledge of naming systems that you might deduct where somebody might have had their ancestry, right? So this is really a practical artistic intervention into the system, into the museum machine, so to speak. How far am I now? Yeah. One thing because I don't want to, because I think the panel is going to be much more interesting than what we have to say. What I would like to say, one thing more, is about the collection. Also in the past period of 4 years, coming out of the question, how many women, how many black people, etc., 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 our director has decided in collaboration with the curatorial team in our conversations that we're going to spend 50% of our annual budget on people. We don't say people of color, we say, are you making a photograph or are you filming? I don't enjoy being filmed, it's not nice, thank you. So 50% of our budget is being spent on people with a heritage background outside of Northern Europe and or the United States. So we call it a heritage background, not black or brown, with a strong emphasis on women, right? So what you see is in the past 4 years, our collecting strategy has resulted in above 50% of women acquisitions and well above the 50% for people with a different heritage background. And this brings us to the collection, and that's where I want to end, because we have quite an extensive collection, 100,000 pieces. We cannot do repair work on 100,000 pieces in a collection that is 125 years old. So what did I propose? I proposed to draw a, what's the word in English? Artificial line. So it's an artificial device. An artificial line somewhere around 1989. And my director is like, no, 1980, so we're still quarreling, where's the line? It doesn't matter where the line is, it's somewhere around there, between 1980 and 1989. Where everything before that just is what it is. It is what it is. It was a great period. I mean, high modernism, not early modernism, but high modernism to me is like the pinnacle in Western aesthetic thinking. It's great, it's lovely. To me, it's ethnography. It's what a group of people, a specific culture produced in a specific time, and let's study it like that. So what happens then with the collection after '89? We can then start looking at this collection, which is much smaller, and then form it along the lines of the mores. What's the mores? Along our lines of thinking today, where we think that more women, artists, more people of color, etc., etc., etc. So you can actually work with this collection of 89 until now and bring it into the balance that we think is the right balance today. It will be much harder to do it with the collection 50 to 80, very hard, and let alone with the collection up until 1950. That's just crazy. What we do, however, is that we've done our research, and for Britain, that would be a much bigger task, but the Netherlands only had a few colonies relatively to, to Great Britain. So we looked at all the colonized spaces, Suriname until South Africa, Indonesia. Especially with the Caribbean now, we have identified all the artists that we know of that have worked in these spaces, yeah, since like 1850. We're now in the process of, for that we do use AI, bringing in view the networks, and as such identifying the key players in these networks. And then by identifying the key players in these networks and seeing when did they work, we can start identifying what kind of work did they made, i.e. what do we need in our collection. So it's like a proper strategy, research strategy to come to buy certain works and add them to the collection. And why do we want to add them to the collection? Because the descendants of these people of the ex-colonized spaces are now Dutch citizens, and when we buy, for instance, a contemporary work by an artist who was born in Sint Maarten, it's just not, it would be better practice if the work doesn't float in space just like that, but actually has a lineage going back into the collection all the way to 1900. Yeah? So, I think I would like to stop there, but just give you an insight in when you look at the museum machine, yeah, and you as a, let's say, practitioner, and what can your role as a practitioner be within that museum machine. And for me, it is a very, it's a practice driven by, let's say, an artistic methodology where identity is not a subject. Identity is a method. It's a method. It's a way of thinking, but it's not a subject. And that's the last thing I want to say about it, because another colleague, the same colleague, pointed that out. That 80s, 90s, identity was a subject, right? But for collecting works today, I don't know. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Charl, for that presentation with your characteristic candor. What I've always enjoyed with the conversations that we've had over the years, which you brought also today, is that you always speak from your subject position. So there's always a sense of both authority and clarity in your words. And I very much look forward to bringing forward some of the points that you raised around identity as method, around questions of deracialization, to the conversation that we'll have presently. But for now, everyone, I'd like to just turn and invite our second speaker, whom we know as artist, researcher, and writer. Today, obviously, Susan has been very much speaking to us from the chair as her professor of contemporary art at UAL, and is also as director of the Decolonising Arts Institute at UAL. But I'd like to just invite us to think a little more in relation to Susan's extensive work as a practicing artist. And you'll know from your notes that Susan has been showing widely in relation to institutions across the world. Refer to shows at Villa Arson in Nice, the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, and somewhere closer to home in terms of Southampton City Gallery. I have a memorable event in my mind of visiting Susan's show, A Coven, a Grove, a stand at the First Sight Museum in Colchester, and understanding the depth of Susan's research in relation to both methods and practices, but also context in relation to the ways in which materials can be brought together to generate a whole suite of new thoughts about a given subject. I look forward to hearing what Susan has to say today in relation to our current concerns. So please join me in welcoming Susan to the lectern.
So I feel strangely nervous. My head is spinning. Thank you, David, for the introduction, and Charl for your words before, which have added to the spinning. Thank you, everyone, for still being here. I did have 6 notes, but I only have time for 5. So, suitably enough, I'll be removing the last one. Removes. One, circling, squaring. Circling archives, squaring collections, I want to consider certain moments of danger as an artist, facing artists, facing archives, facing collections, facing institutions, facing histories, facing ancestors, facing aporia, facing aphasias. Ever alert, ever running out of time, yet trying to slow, pause, slow down, trying to hold the voices and words of others in my ears, in my gut, speaking to and with after Trinh Minh Ha, trying to move after Maria Lugones, quote, against and away from that hushing of the manyness of the past in the present. All the images here refer to my practice research into the Gate Foundation archive in the Van Abbe Museum collection since 2016. You may have heard some sounds over the lunch break. So far, this has generated an essay, a video, 3 iterations of a site-specific installation, several rehearsals and conversations. Coinciding with transforming collections, and before that, Black artists and modernism, this practice research is necessarily informed by and informs these larger projects. My navigation and negotiation of archives in and out of institutions goes back to the late 1990s, from a PhD with AVA, the African and Asian Visual Artists Archive at the University of East London, to residencies and commissions exploring the regional Central England News and Media Archive, the National Chinese Embassy and International Olympics Archives at the BFI, and informal, fan-generated internet archives of martial arts epics at once globally popular and little known to the West. Deviating and digressing between lines, noting gaps and stops, lapses in language and memory, often seeking signs of the mundane unmoorings of ordinary, extraordinary migrations. This preoccupation with archives is, I think, a conscious and unconscious attempt to counter amnesias, a constant threat. How not to forget? I'm sounding notes of caution to myself as much as anyone else in the ongoing critical work of resounding, resounding, revoicing, reconstituting archives in, with, and without collections, questioning their and my location, dislocation, and potential to conjure and contest past formations, future histories. Circling may suggest movement, action, and ambiguous, ambivalent relations. Enclosing, containing, contemplating from the outside, a place of both power and powerlessness. Squaring may suggest alignment, adjustment, straightening, levelling, balancing. No, we don't need our collections to be any straighter. Yes, we do need to consider the balance in every encounter. Who is doing the levelling, up, down, or sideways? What is flattened, pushed out in the process? By what measures are standards determined and normalised as universal? Ever thus. 2. Living archives, living collections. Circling back to Ava, where my doctoral research began, with the gaps and illusions around Asia and the Asian in the archive, an enduring question. This beginning coincided with Ava's Living Archive conference at Tate Gallery, where Stuart Hall spoke to the idea of constituting an archive, opening with this warning from Walter Benjamin, quote, "To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognise it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger." Speaking to a moment of transition and transformation in the mid-1990s, as Ava and organisations such as Carla Press, Third Text, Innova, Over, Panchayat were being instituted and or becoming part of institutions, Hall reminds us of the complicated spectrum and heterogeneity of practices at stake, the need to contest the terms and beware of the apparatus that slips silently into place. Sizing up monolithic history and singular linear truths, seizing hold of memories in multiple, multivocal, holding on to the potential of archival disorder and incoherence. What might we discover in their very ruptures and dispersion? Archives are often seen as still, static, inert, seldom prioritised, resources always scarce. Still but not dead, static but only in stasis, inert but only dormant, in suspended sleep as they are held or carried across institutional and individual bodies. Whose care or carelessness, willful or otherwise, keeps them and us from stirring? How might the archive reanimate and live in the collections that are supposedly ours, but not yet ours? How to render our collections living? Archives accumulate artists, collections accumulate archives, and artists accumulate archives too. Except for a relative few, collections are arguably harder to gather and corral. As subjects with agency in flux, as well as objects of study, we are more than our traces. The keepers cannot keep us, even when they care. Self-archiving to survive, many and more than collections can contain, let alone restore. This excess is important to remember. Which is to say, to state the obvious, that at any given moment, our files are partial, selective, fragmented, always incomplete. Which is also to say that the archives built by us and collections built upon us, with us and without us, are necessarily ridden with holes. Absences, omissions, variations and contradictions as we continue to reversion and reiterate ourselves. The complete record is impossible. Consistency an illusion. The ambition to fill gaps, make whole and coherent, arguably misplaced. If we attend and accept the gaps and inconsistencies, dwell on the inconsequential, the marginalia and ephemera, what might be discerned in the detail, the differences, the dust? 3. Rewind. In 2016, I begin to move towards the gate. Established in 1988 in Amsterdam, quote, to stimulate communication between Western and non-Western art, its history falls broadly into two phases under two directors, Els van der Plas and Sebastian Lopez, shifting from its initial purpose to promote cultural exchange by showcasing foreign artists to exhibiting contemporary artists of colour and artists with migrant backgrounds based in or from the Netherlands. By its closure in 2006, it had accumulated documentation on more than 750 so-called non-Dutch artists, plus a specialised library. I hear how the Gate had shut down abruptly after losing state funding, how its archives had been saved by the museum on the verge of being skipped, and how it had arrived in a state of total disarray. Books and artists' files were gradually integrated into the library, while institutional papers were placed in 31 orderly boxes, their disorder contained for the next decade. There are also 8 boxes of uncatalogued stuff that somehow become 20 between visits, moving and multiplying without explanation. The comedy moment. Comic interlude. Not done yet, but thank you. Thank you. Through the Gate reflects on my halting process as anecdote and rumour accumulate and so-called facts oscillate. Lost in loose ends, looking for ways to embrace the chaos and opacity with optimistic uncertainty, I wonder, what is institutional truth? And where does truth lie? Meeting the archive's unknown scope with my own known limits, lack of index or inventory aside, my not speaking Dutch and ignorance of the cultural landscape are obvious barriers. Perusing the papers reveals connections with AVA, Innova, Third Text, local and international networks intersecting, my own vested interests surfacing. I move circuitously between catalogued and uncatalogued dimensions, drawn increasingly to the boxes of unassimilated, unassuming stuff floating between systems. Slides, photographs, negatives, cards and notebooks, letters, press cuttings, diaries, guest books, CDs, DVDs, VHS and U-matic tapes, audio cassettes and assorted ephemera, including 2 biscuits. Materials left behind, within yet without the archive, raising questions of status, ownership, responsibility and care. Soon after rescuing the Gate, the museum attempted to activate the archive by inviting academics and researchers to dive in and play. This led to some public screenings of videos found in the boxes and their swift withdrawal with apologies when word reached one of the artists, Chong Ang. How did the Gate look after the artists it worked with or the materials collected for its archive? Having sought to support artists neglected by institutions, was the Gate also guilty of neglect? What then of Van Abbe's relationship with the Gate and the artists therein? What intangible relations does the museum inherit along with the tangible artifacts? 4. Rewind again. Before my first visit to the archive, online searches yield little. A single short interview in Art Asia Pacific, 1997, where Lopez name-checks 9 artists grouped together as Asian. Bupen Karka, Wang Du, C.K. Tang, Ding Yi, Hong Hao, Chong Ang, Yiling Tang, Tariq Alvi, Ken Lum. At Van Abbe, their digital traces are uneven. 3, 5, 10 entries in the catalogue, or none. Chong'an, the most visible, with 39 items, mostly exhibition publications spanning the history of the gate and several suggestive categories. Alienation, art design, art education, exchanges, gendered art, globalization, identity, manifestations, Netherlands, painting, prizes, triennials, video art. Beyond the catalogue, Ang surfaces again in the analogue artists' files and uncatalogued boxes, the only artist, I surmise, to traverse the gate, the Van Abbe Library, and museum records. It takes me a while to realise that his early works, acquired in the 1990s, are sitting in the stores behind me, unseen since 2005. From promising young Dutch artist to other, Ang's increasingly experimental and collaborative practice moves from painterly high modernism to situation comedy, from artist studio to TV set, from academy to soap opera, seminar to pop concert. Such turns and seeming schisms may have confused the collectors and curators that once courted him, making him increasingly difficult to see and place. The video, Ang Archivery, reflects my process and discomfort as I encounter the many gazes across Ang's work, which seem to form a trail of clues and dares, to face the violence of looking, not looking, looking back, in complex alliance and complicity. This discomfort growing with the feeling that I am somehow stalking the artist, whom I happen to have met in Guangzhou the year before. Eventually, I write to Ang to confess, and he joins me on my last visit to the archive. We retrace his traces in the archive and relocate his paintings in the store. He brings more books, updating the museum with new documentation, including from Guangzhou. I see my 7-year-old son in the poorest scene of his work, Our Lives and Archivery, Entangled. 5. Replay. An archivery. The prefix an denotes a lack, a state of being without, a negation. The suffix y, archivy, archivery, suggesting approximate conditions, ersatz states. If the archive is always already an archive, lacking, missing, without, an archive, not archive, how can the museum confront its condition as always already fractured, incoherent? How might it hold the accidental and deliberate ruptures, surface the schisms it often seeks to smooth? Chong'an's work has since been brought out of the store and into the collection displays. Meanwhile, Van Abbe committed further funds to inventorizing the gate, which now has a finding aid. Returning 2 years later, I'm invited to open up the gate again. How to bring it out of the basement and boxes and shadows. How to relocate it, not beneath or behind the museum or glass in vitrines, but situate it as central, integral, its legacies entwined with Van Abbe's. How to experience the archive differently as physical, material, sensory, and embodied encounter, part of the museum's living history. My subsequent returns are remote, thanks to the COVID pandemic. Still unable to access the paper archive, I'm drawn once again to the now much smaller pile of uncatalogued stuff, the remaining grey objects, tapes in old, aging, and obsolete technologies, labels cursory, cryptic, illegible, seminar something, symposium something, roundtable something, blank. What were those urgent conversations, I wonder? And would they resonate now? Digitizing the analogue, re-digitizing the digital, translating between formats and languages, I listen, re-listen, transcribe and transpose about 20 hours of recordings. The conversations are strangely familiar, even if the terms have changed. The language of benevolence, aid, and development, the essentializing, exoticizing tendencies still very much with us. Jumping between years and places, identities and contexts are unclear, but for a hint here and there. Voices are forthright and faint, English dominating, accents proliferating. Where are we? Who is speaking? Who is silent? Still tracing. Early on, I come across 2 mixtapes of Western pop songs from 1940 to 1988. I listen seriously here too, separating lyrics from melodies and noting recurring sentiments of loss and longing. Eventually, these find their way into a script score for remote and live play. I imagine these unsung words as somehow evoking the unsaid emotional undertow and toll pulling on and driving the disparate dialogues across the decade. Weaving new recordings into old, an archival collage of reimagined exchanges, the unseen becomes the seen. In Rewind Replay, I try to materialize the archive through its dislocations, mediations, and poor translations, to multiply moments of encounter with the misplaced and unplaced, to revoice, resound, unrehearse and reorientate the collection, to hear better and listen to the manyness of the past in the present. I invite you to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Blah, 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 blah.